this speech is to celebrate someone who's been entrepreneurial, and this man is not a yes minister kind of public servant. He's a yes we can minister or no minister kind of public servant, but I suspect there wasn't much in between. And just one final observation, that Sir Thomas McIlwraith may have wanted to resume Papua New Guinea to keep the Germans at bay, but by the time of the 60s we had Hielscher, we had Schubert running the Premier's office, we even had a minister called Hinds. Well, 2 out of 3 isn't bad, and I'd just like to ask the best of 3 to come up and deliver his speech.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. You know, that story about the three of us, Schubert, Hinds and Hielscher, it was, Hinsey was coming up the corridor to my office, shuffling up. You could hear him coming, and I always had an open door. And he gets coming up and he says, "Hielscher." And I responded, "Hinds." And he came to the door and he said, "Where's that bastard Hielscher?" He said, Schubert, he said. "Us Krauts will run this fucking country." Anyhow, it is a great honour for me to have been asked to give this Sir Thomas McIlwraith oration. Bob Tucker has already spoken of Sir Thomas at good length, and he was certainly, for many years, the dominant figure in colonial politics in Queensland. He was Premier, as you said, on 3 separate occasions, from 1879 to 83, again in 1888, and again in 1893. As Bob has mentioned, he has been referred to as the Queensland Caesar, as he thundered across the Queensland political and business landscape in those earlier pioneering days. But I won't say any more about Sir Thomas than that, and get on with the business. I've named this presentation Queensland, Where From, Where At, Where To. Now, where from is history, it's fact, and the where at and the where to might not be so factual. It might be my point of view. And I do hope I have as many friends as I have now when I'm finished. I will spend some time on the where from to paint the picture of lifestyle and living conditions 50 or 90 years ago. They were quite different and from today and needed resolute attention. How we got out of those doldrums comes next, to the period in the late 80s when we had achieved the status of one of the best regional economies in the world. I'll then look at Queensland today and finally offer my views on what we should do now to ensure its future. By the early 1960s, as far as our lifestyle, our wealth and future prospects were concerned, we had really reached the pits. How did that happen? We have to go back to the 30s, 40s and 50s to see what life was like back then and what the outside influences were that drove us down to the third world standard just 50 or so years ago. Up until 1940, my home in Yamundi was 4-roomed, that's not 4-bedroomed, it's 4-roomed, plus a front veranda where the kids slept. There was no electricity. We had kerosene lights and lanterns, wood stove, no refrigerator, no sewage, tank water caught from the roof. There was no bitumen roads. Roads were little more than tracks, impassable if it rained, and that's only 1960. We had 3 house cows that were let out each day into the long paddock, which was the road. They provided milk, cream, homemade butter, fertiliser for the garden, where we grew all our vegetables and fruit trees. We had our own chooks, and really it was a subsistence living. The Great Depression of the 30s put men out of work and closed down the economy. Dad's work time was reduced to 3 days a week. I can still recall seeing young men out of work with their swags on their backs, walking the railway tracks and roads from town to town to qualify for food rations authorised by the local police, sleeping rough under railway bridges or wherever. There was also an overriding threat and worry in the expected Japanese invasion, which almost happened in the early 40s. In the 40s, the domestic economic conditions stagnated as full attention was dedicated to the war effort. Queensland particularly was a frontline state, which really caused decimation of whatever infrastructure we had, such as railways, roads, public amenities and such like. The 50s were very little better than the 30s and 40s as we went through 10 more years of austerity. The governments, fearful of runaway inflation, which would have wrecked the economy completely, had clamped down on spending. Really then, for over 30 years, 10 of depression, 10 of war in the aftermath, and then 10 of austerity, the whole community, the government and citizens were imbued with a careful outlook. We must not spend, we must put it away for a rainy day and so forth. The 60s were our turning point, but we still endured what was in fact a third world existence. Our cities were not sewered, our suburban streets were gravel and dust, our roads were 2 lanes and gravel and would not get us to Townsville if it rained. Our railway was prehistoric and steam driven with a theme song, I'll Walk Beside You. We had small cottage industries such as stove foundries, a shoe manufacturer, wool scours and abattoirs, but no head offices, no large-scale manufacturing, and no services industries of note. In those days, you painted your own house, mowed your own lawn, grew your own veggies in the backyard, repaired your own car, etc. We relied almost entirely on our primary industries, no export coal industry, no aluminium, no tourism, and Brisbane stopped at McIlwraith and Chermside. The Queensland Treasury was broke to the extent that one year in the 60s we had to ask the Commonwealth Government for a temporary loan to pay for the public service wages. Furthermore, we had no way of getting out of this desperate position. We could not benefit from rising tax revenue because the economy was not producing additional income, taxable income. The Loan Council wouldn't let us borrow our way out of the malaise. This was just 50 years ago. You can all remember that, can't you? Well, how did we get out of this mess? Firstly, we needed a team of young, dedicated, energetic and enthusiastic university graduates to help us in the task ahead. I recruited these youngsters into Treasury, skirting around public service protocol that relied on the rigidity of precedent and seniority. We then had to convince the government and the population generally that with no money in the bank and no domestic capital that Treasury could borrow, we should introduce overseas capital, whether everyone liked it or not. We had to convince the Queensland people that overseas capital would produce thousands of times more for the economy than it would take back in dividends. We also had to show overseas investors that our government was prepared to facilitate the establishment and development of major industry and infrastructure here in Queensland. Not fund them, we had no money, but we had the resources they needed and we had the capacity and willingness to clear the way for their development. For the coal industry, for example, the state initially drilled the Bowen Basin and established the enormity of the reserve. We then used the conditions we attached to the miners' mineral lease to secure the development to the best advantage of Queensland and Queenslanders. We also had to get the state budget into balance. This was achieved by strict control of expenditure and then by seeking out sources of revenue other than taxation of the Queensland citizens. The solution flowed from a rapid diversification of the economy that broadened the tax base. We then modernised the mining royalties, which had been set at the general rate of 5 cents or 6pence a tonne, by adding the 3-letter word per, PER, between 5 and cents, making it 5% of the value of the mineral. If the mineral was used to value add in Queensland, and 10% if it was simply quarried and expelted. I'm sure Treasurer of today would be thanking me daily for this change in the Concurrent with these general measures, all of our major projects and the major economic development in Queensland, including the coal industry, the aluminium industry and the overseas tourism industry, proceeded at nil cost to the Queensland taxpayer and with no remaining debt. Once these were in place, we not only had a balanced state budget, Queensland had a AAA credit rating that made borrowings in the world markets easier and cheaper. The debt was only for projects that serviced their own debt obligations, such as ports, railways, toll roads, electricity, etc. And this debt was exceeded by our own cash reserves. We had what we called a negative net debt. Also, all of the state's obligations, such as for public servant superannuation, were fully funded, a worldwide unique record. This reminds me of an occasion when I was presenting to the bankers in the Savoy Hotel in Zurich in Switzerland. And as I proceeded in the presentation, a gentleman in the front row, his name was Rainer Gut. He was the chairman of Credit Suisse Bank, with whom we'd done a lot of business. And he called out, "Leo, tell them about your fully funded superannuation scheme," which I did. And then I concluded by saying, and we're the only state in Australia that does that. And someone halfway up the hall said, "The only one in the world." Then someone way up the back said, "No, we do it." And I said, "Where are you from, sir?" He said, "Liechtenstein." You all know that Liechtenstein is about as big as the Gabba, not counting the cricket ground. We sometimes had to bend the rules to get to the objective. More often it was creating new rules, thinking outside the square to solve the problem. Some examples are, for the coal industry, we were strongly of the view that the best result for Queensland was that we determined the way that industry developed and that we positioned and owned the infrastructure. For mining companies to own and provide the transport infrastructure, for example, could very well have meant a web of rail lines to the mines, fewer mines for those who could not afford the infrastructure, restricted port access, etc. But that restricted port access was a reality, and it came home to me when we were developing the German Creek mine. And that was a mine with an annual capacity of about 3 million tonnes. It wasn't a big mine, but we had planned to export the coal through Hay Point, a privately owned port owned by one of the biggest companies, mining companies in the world. No names mentioned, but you will know who I'm talking about. And they said, "No, that we have the capacity, but we can't let other coal through. We want it for our own future requirements." So anyhow, we decided then, well, if we have to do that, we'll have to build a new port, which we built at Dalrymple Bay. Now, with the policy of the miners providing the cash for these infrastructure requirements, it wasn't really fair to German Creek with 3 million tonnes to provide for a new port. So we decided we'd work it all out on 6 million tonnes, and I'd run the risk of getting a further throughput to make it 6 million tonnes. Well, fortunately, by the time we opened the port, we had 12 million tonnes, and we still had it costed at 6 million tonnes. So it was a really cash cow. Anyhow, the decision was taken that it was to be government-owned rail and ports after that episode. The rail system would be new and offered 2-kilometre-long trains, each powered by 6 diesel electric engines, 1 crew up front, bottom-dump wagons with the trains being loaded and unloaded without stopping. The gauge would be 3'6", so we could use the rolling stock statewide. The ports would be new and deep, up to 500,000 tonne ships, which would enable us to compete in the world markets. To Europe, for example, the shipping freight was $10 a tonne cheaper in 500,000 tonne ships than for the Panamax vessels. Panamax vessels are those that can go through the Panama Canal. To Japan, $3.50 cheaper. The miners were happy with the concept, but argued the funding proposal. They were told we needed a guarantee that once all this first-class infrastructure was provided, they would use it to capacity, because there was only them and kangaroos out there. And if their overseas customers didn't send the ships for any reason, we needed security for our expected freight revenue. Once again, they were okay with the concept of a security deposit. But when told the size of the deposit equalled the cost of the new railway plus the cost of the rolling stock, discussion began in earnest. We built the line and rolling stock funded by the security deposit provided by the miners, which was returned to them over a period of 10 years, if they performed as they said they would, at 8% interest per annum. And these repayments, of course, came from a discrete addition to their rail freight. But they got it back. And of course, the rail freight is tax deductible to them. For the aluminium industry, as you are aware, aluminium is simply bauxite and heaps of electricity. So we had to get electricity to the company at world competitive prices before we could insist that they upgrade the bauxite here in Queensland. And we had to do that at no cost to the taxpayer or other electricity user. The competition they would be facing was from smelters in Invercargill in New Zealand and Seattle, US, which were happily enjoying cheap hydropower. Now, value adding was substantially more beneficial to the economy than simply quarrying and exporting the bauxite. Rough figures show refining the bauxite to alumina increased the economic benefit to the state by a multiple of 4. Smelting the alumina to aluminium multiplies that by 4 again. That is 16 times more valuable to the economy than simply mining and exporting. How then could we provide that electricity at a cheaper, more competitive price? This was achieved by securing a special loan allocation from the Loan Council to finance the building of the Gladstone Power Station. This loan could be raised at much cheaper interest and repayment conditions than private borrowings. So the financing costs of providing electricity was refined down. We then had to get the coal into the new power station at the cheapest possible cost. As it happened, we were negotiating a new mineral lease for the coking coal mine at Blackwater. The coking coal had an overburden of lesser quality steaming coal, and we were able to negotiate the coking coal lease to provide the steaming coal to the state at nil cost, other than for washing and transportation. The power price was now competitive. There would not be an aluminium industry in Queensland now had this not been possible. I'll jump to the conclusion of where from by simply mentioning a few more examples. The tourism industry was still only functioning domestically, camping at the beach, caravanning, etc. The industry was told that there were overseas tourists from Europe, Japan, USA and Asia waiting to come to Queensland. But we needed tourist terminals, not just camping sites and high-rise buildings at the coast. They responded that they would provide all of this once they came. Well, back to front. It was a standoff. The solution was the introduction of casinos, whose licences required them, amongst other things, to provide golf courses, guided tours and other tourist terminal facilities, which set the norm for all other tourist hotels. The cultural centre in South Brisbane was built at no cost to the state budget or residual debt. Expo 88, South Bank, the Gold Coast film industry, Lucinda Long Wharf, sugar terminals, the gateway bridges, etc. are all examples of great public infrastructure provided at no cost to the taxpayer. There's a story behind all those. Each one of those has its own story. There was no one cap fits all. Well, where are we now? Now this is where I'm going to lose friends. I must be careful from here on, as I'm now 91 and haven't seen recent figures and haven't experienced recent circumstances since my retirement 5 years ago. The following observations originate from my armchair in my apartment in the retirement village, but I'll do my best. With that qualification, look out. The recent state budget papers confirmed that we now have an $80-odd billion debt. This compared with a $20 billion debt throughout the 80s and the 90s. As I mentioned, this earlier debt was for infrastructure such as ports and rail extensions, electricity, local authority, capital works, etc., that serviced the debt. We also had cash assets that exceeded the debt. In other words, we had the debt covered twice over with nil negative effect on the state budget. we must really worry about this $80 million debt. For 80, well, I wouldn't let my fellows use the word billion. I said use the $1,000 million, and you can appreciate it better that way. For an $80,000 million debt, the interest cost, even at today's relatively low interest rate, would be fairly close to $2,500 million per annum. We should be trying desperately to cap and then reduce the size of this millstone. If we attack and then try to eliminate the debt over, say, 20 years, and that's a long time, the cost of the budget would be in the vicinity of $5.5 billion per annum. That is $5,500 million out of the budget each year before we start to consider funding for schools, hospitals, police, etc. $5,500 million is a lot of money. It would pay for our Cross River Rail project in year one, with 19 years to spare. Unfortunately, also there seems to be no plan or program to pay off the debt. It's still growing. Sorry, kids. Sorry, grandkids. We have lost our AAA rating. A lot of our cash reserves, superannuation surpluses and such like have been tapped, and the debt is still rising. Our budgets have been balanced by allocations from our cash reserves. And as far as the economy is concerned, we seem to be relying on the momentum from previous years' efforts. Except for casinos and high-rise accommodation, there's nothing substantial and new being added. I'm also concerned at the advice the government is receiving from its departments. For example, with Adani, with our gas exports and with bauxite exports from a new mine in the Gulf, are we getting as much as we should from Queensland and Queenslanders? For Adani, we would have owned the railway line and its rolling stock, and he would have paid for it. It seems now Adani owns the line, and he asks us to front up with $1 billion towards its cost. With our gas export industry, why didn't we, in the negotiations for the mineral leases, have put aside a percentage of product at a very favourable price for our own use and benefit, and release the rest for export? Anyhow, well, where do we go from here? Some of our efforts should be directed to the following tasks, and these are not in any order of priority. They're just, firstly, I'd suggest that serious efforts be directed towards reverting the public service to its previous role, functioning under what was known as the Westminster system, where the long-serving professional public servant had no party political affiliation or leaning and advised the government of the day, no matter what its party politics were. These public service advisors had a lifetime experience and a long-term forward planning, not just the 3 years they get today, or 3 or 6 years. Based on their professional expertise, they recommended to the government what in their view was the best for the state and for Queensland people. It should be recognised that the minister's discipline is politics and a lot of common sense, and they can support these priorities with as many political advisors as they think necessary. The department's heads and their advisors' disciplines are economics, health, education, road building, dam building, depending on the departments they administer. Ministers need advice from these qualified professionals. In my career, for example, I served 10 premiers and 15 treasurers with political philosophies ranging from Genghis Khan on the to Karl Marx on the left. And none of them knew what my party political views were, or if I had any. Secondly, we should balance the budget without recourse to the previously provided cash reserves. The state budget is not complex, really. It's very similar to the one at home. If you haven't got the cash, you shouldn't spend it. And you don't borrow to pay the groceries or other lifestyle day-to-day outgoings. In other words, expenditures should be held to the revenues you generate, and debt, as a general rule, should be restricted to capital items that can service their own debt obligations. Thirdly, we must reduce the current debt level. When in previous times cash assets exceeded the debt servicing cost to the annual budget was $0 net. Let's get back to that happy position again. Fourthly, we should be seeking out projects which can fund their own annual costs without dependence on the Queensland taxpayer. I've mentioned examples from previous years, namely the establishment of the coal industry, the aluminium industry, overseas tourism, cultural centre, etc. Fifthly, and this I suggest might be firstly, I know I've got some supporters for this one, we should seek out at least one new major industry to provide a further prop under our ongoing state economy. We cannot rely for too long on the current basis of momentum from previously introduced industries. What sort of new industry should we look for? A couple of perspectives come to mind. We could look seriously at the commercialising of the innovations and discoveries coming out of our universities and institutions. We have proven that we have the academic skills to produce these discoveries. However, the lack of local financial support and risk-taking finds the value added, the commercialisation and the profits are happening in the Silicon Valley. This is where the real benefit to the economy resides, and you and me. I don't mean government funding, as this is a risk where the taxpayer has no available skills. They should not be exposed to that risk. The government's role in this should be confined to encouraging and facilitating domestic investors, perhaps with tax concessions, mentoring or similar. Secondly, we should look at a Snowy Mountains type authority to harvest and bring the more an abundant North Queensland water through the Great Divide. This would firstly irrigate hundreds of square miles of fertile black soil west of Charter Towers, and then as stage 2 carry on to the Warrego River, the northernmost arm of the Darling. The Murray-Darling system benefits and Adelaide gets a drink. The scheme proposed is based in part on the old Bradfield scheme of the 30s, which failed mostly because of lack of funding. It should be a tremendous boost to our economy both during construction and in its operation. State and federal governments will be asked to guarantee the borrowing by the authority. There will be no cost to the government budget unless, of course, the scheme failed and the guarantees were called upon. In conclusion, what we need right now is a clean coal-fired power station to maximise our natural strength. We have plenty of coal, and coal-fired power generation produces one of the cheapest electricities. We need Adani or other project of similar size and with greater economic benefit remaining with Queensland, and we need another Sir Thomas McIlwraith. And maybe another Keith Lacey, Joan Sheldon, or Andrew Fraser, who I believe are next up to pull me to pieces. Thank you.
You've got to stay here. Well done. You've got to stay here.
Stay here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Leo. Most of you won't realise this, but Leo actually auditioned for this spot. We don't do it to most of our guest speakers, but last year my daughter, who I'm very proud of obviously, graduated with a commerce degree. And Leo here was given an honorary PhD by Queensland Uni, and he also gave the speech. The address you've heard tonight is 5 times better than the speech that he gave then. So he's obviously been working on it and thinking, but very well done, Leo, and we support a lot of the things that you suggested there. And now I'm going to call on 3 people who know you very well to do what I think they colloquially call a roast. But you've only got 3 minutes each, lady and gentleman, and I think we'll start in order of first tenure. I was going to say age, but I'm not sure that's true, Keith. Keith DeLacy.
Hi Leo, I know you too well to tell too many stories about you, but I'd like to know, to start off with, whether I was part of the Genghis Khan or the Karl Marx part of it. Isn't it funny, I mean, just reflecting on something that Leo said, that how outraged we were that the federal government would be providing a concessional loan to Adani to build a railway line, when since the beginning of time, or since Leo's time, the bloody government built it all themselves, let alone lending money to somebody to build a railway line.
With their money.
That's right. It's been a pleasure for me, Leo, to be, related to you over the years. If I can tell just a few stories about you. When I first became Treasurer, Leo wandered in one day, I'd only been there about a week, and sat down and he said, "Look, mate," he said, "I need you to come with me to Japan and Europe to sell this new coupon that we've just released." I said, "Gee, that's interesting. Yeah, I thought about that." So we talked about it for some time, and towards the end of it, Leo said, "Jesus, have a look at the time." He said, "I've got to do the Russian general." I said, "What do you mean by the Russian general?" He said, "Pissanov." and it struck me then that I thought I could have a good time with Leo, and we did. We had wonderful times together, and I gave up drinking when I became Treasurer. I never had a drink for 8 years, would you believe? And went overseas with Leo a number of times, and never had a drink. And then one day he said to me, he said, "It's about time you had a champagne." I had a champagne, and I was just thinking of that tonight. Or he said, that first champagne I'd had after 8 years of non-drinking, I could feel every nerve ending in the whole body. And I've been a piss pot ever since, Leo. But anyway, I just like to think of Leo as a wonderful Queenslander and a great friend of mine. Thank you.
Keith, you're wondering where you fitted between Karl Marx and who's the other fellow?
Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan. Well, you know, I've had, as I said, the 15 treasurers in that time, but they've all, like a good public servant, my comment on them is that they've all been good. But some have been gooder than others.
So a debaucher of good treasurers, Joan Sheldon.
Thank you. Well, as one of the esteemed 15, you can see why we were all in awe of Sir Leo. When I became Treasurer, he was Chair of the Queensland Treasury Corporation. And the QTC, I suppose, to put it in layman's terms, tends to look after the funds for the government. So as Keith said, when Leo did these trips overseas to get money for the various infrastructure we needed, because we couldn't borrow, could we, unless it was ports or whatever, he took the treasurers with him. And I could say that they were, as Keith said, very interesting trips. Unlike you, Keith, I needed the odd champagne. I don't know about you. But on one occasion, we were in Hong Kong, and we'd been fated to dinner the night before, and the next morning I had to give a speech, and we then went to see the various banks. And Stephen Rochester, who was then the CEO, came to me early in the morning and said, "Leo had what we think could be a heart attack last night, and he's in the Hong Kong private hospital. So today we've got to do it ourselves." Because the Treasurer went along, Leo and co used to do the spiel, we'd say our bit. We even had a booklet saying how great Queensland was, which we were. And so I spoke at the breakfast, and then we decided who'd go where, and I said, "Well, I'll go to Bank of America," which was a little unheard of, that the Treasurer went off on their own, but I did. So I went there and did the spiel, sold the coupon, or tried to do it, whatever it was we were then doing. And the guy from Bank of America said, "I can't believe this. You guys don't have any debt at all. I'll take whatever it is you've got. What do you want?" And spelt out this terrific deal and said, "Do we have a deal?" And I said, "Well, look, I think for courtesy, the chair of the QTC is currently unwell. I'm going to go back and speak with him because I knew I'd get executed if I took the deal. So up I went to the hospital and Leo's there with all sorts of things attached to various machines because they thought he'd had a heart attack. So I said, how are you going? He said, I shouldn't be here, I'm fine. And I said, well, just relax. He said, what have you done today? So I told him. He said, you went on your own to the Bank of America. And I said, yes, I did. And he said, and I said, they had this great deal. And I told him, and he said, what? He sat up out of bed, all the machines went mad, and he said, you didn't take it, did you? And I said, well, no, Leo, I didn't. When the doctors and nurses arrived from everywhere, and I'd created this great havoc. It turns out, anyhow, that Leo had indigestion because the night before at this dinner, one of the things they'd served was foie gras. And Leo, who always knew his good food and wine, had some, you see. So I woke up, obviously, with chronic indigestion. We all thought, I was talking about trying to send him home. He said, I'm not going home because we were going to various parts around the world. I'm not going home, I'm going with you. And when we found out it was indigestion, he did. But to this day, I often think of his reaction, the fact that no treasurer would have the temerity to do a deal on their own, and that Leo actually nearly had a heart attack because he thought I did. Leo has been a wonderful mentor and friend to me over many years. He was a wonderful public servant. I totally agree with you, Leo, about making the public service politicised. I was saying to Keith before that I had a great treasury which I inherited, and the only public servant I ever changed was the under-treasurer, and I put in Doug McTaggart because I could trust him. Treasury is a huge organisation, and as you well know, treasurers come and go. But I could always trust Leo, and I think you did a wonderful job for Queensland, and you made damn sure that we kept your credo. Thank you.
Just stay a minute. Joan, do you recall my first visit to you as chairman of the Queensland Treasury Corporation? I went up with about a page and a half of dot points.
You did. Day two.
Of what QTC was doing, what it was about, what the issues were, and so forth. But A, B, C is okay, but then when I get into QPRS, I had Project X and a few more without any description. And for the next month, she'd be deviling me by, what's this Project X? Anyhow, it was the privatisation of SGIO.
Which I agreed with, and we did as a government.
That's right.
It was then Suncorp Network.
Good job.
And Andrew Fraser.
So following 9, 10, you get 15. I wanted to start with day two also, sitting at the desk in the Treasurer's office, and Leo bounded in with the kind of energy that kind of belied his age, and he said, "Do you like this joint?" And I said, "Well, I think it's all right." And he goes, "I built it." Which is the equivalent of the greatest ever power handshake ever. But the little roast I wanted to give was, Leo is 49 years and 11 months older than I, so let's call it 50 years. And we were travelling once on one of the Treasury roadshows that 9 and 10 have mentioned, and this one happened to finish on October the 22nd, which is a venerated day. Have I got the date right? Is that the birthday?
October 1, maybe.
October 1,
Yeah.
Sorry, there you go. It was Leo's birthday, however, and he was turning 48, as he told the assembled crew of Japanese bankers who, with that great kind of Japanese sense of humour, completely didn't get it. He said, I'm turning 48 tonight. I was 38 last year. And he said, I seem to be getting old all the time. And they just didn't get the joke that he was turning 84. So the famous kind of ability to tell a story finally found its limit against a set of Japanese bankers. But the dinner wears on. There's a little bit of levity. A cake comes in. It was all kind of quite formal for a moment. And then the dinner finishes, but Leo decides that that's not good enough for his birthday, and it's also the last night on tour. So we retired to the captain's bar, and there is sake. And it was actually one of the great nights I've ever spent with Leo. There's been a few. We went from politics to life, love, happiness, loss, how to run the world, what's good with people, what's wrong with people, how to make the most out of public service, how to make the most out of personal relationships. And at some point, I thought it was my duty to walk Leo to his room. So I did, and along the way I thought, tomorrow morning's going to be a tough start. So here's me at 50 years younger, walking Leo to his room. I see him in, I think that's a good job. Off you go and grab a couple of hours sleep, get ready for the next day. The next morning I felt like a second-hand lawnmower. We had one more breakfast to do. It was the land of the venerated old man, so we go to the breakfast, and I think it was a bloke from Daiichi Life. He's there. Leo had known him for about 200 years. I was staring at a cup of coffee, black coffee, and that's all about I was willing to contemplate. Leo bounded in, ordered soft poached eggs, sat down, looked at me, and he said, I needed the Barocca this morning, and got into the eggs. And at that moment I realised, for all of Leo's great strengths, his constitution was actually the one that no one had ever appreciated. I just wanted to say, treasurers don't get many human moments, but Leo actually gave me one of my great human moments in public service. He tapped me in the captain's bar at the Mandarin Oriental and said, I need to send you a letter shortly, which was, in Leo's own way, a request to retire after 67 years. Yeah. And the morning we were announcing the retirement, he came in for a cup of tea in Parliament House, and it was about 8 o'clock before the bells went, and I said, I just wanted to let you know something. When we announce your retirement, we're proposing to name the Gateway Bridges after you, which was in fact Queensland's first PPP, which Leo just touched on in his speech. The famous twinkle in the eye that gets spoken about actually just turned into something just beyond a twinkle for a second before he regained his composure, as only Leo can. And he looked at me and he said, you know what I really like about that? I'm going to get him coming and going, and that's good business.